Hi, this is Gilbert Gottfried, and I'm here with my co-host, Frank Santopadre, and we're once again at Nutmeg with our engineer, Frank Verderosa, and this is Gilbert and Frank's Amazing Colossal Obsessions.
Colossal Obsessions.
Pure polish.
Yes.
You know that? You're like Durwood Kirby.
I thought of myself more of an Alan Funt.
An Alan Funt type?
Yes,
I don't think Alan Funt was a well-liked guy. Maybe
No.
maybe our guest today can help answer
Yes.
that, since he knows a lot about show business. We have our pal, Mark Malkoff.
Nice to see you,
with
gentlemen.
us.
When we were talking off the air, you said, and we've had him on the show, and I did a movie with him, the actual problem child, Michael Oliver.
Michael Oliver, Johnny in the 80s, early 90s.
Well, let me set you up before we get to that.
Yes.
Mark is the host of a terrific podcast called the Carson Podcast that you guys should know about. In fact, we get mail about your show.
Oh, that's nice. I do the same about you guys,
Well,
too.
that's nice, because we're both doing shows about the golden age of show business.
Exactly.
Yours is very specifically geared toward Mr. Carson.
That's correct.
And how many have you done?
I think we've released, 115. I've done probably 125.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's a great show.
Thank you.
It's a great show. And we'll get into detail, but satisfy Gilbert. Tell him he's Michael Oliver.
Michael Oliver did the Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, plugging Problem Child. And that was when he was definitely having kids on the show. He went through a time period where Quinn Cummings, you remember her?
Of course. I follow her on Twitter.
Goodbye, Girl.
Yeah.
So in her memoir, I wanted to try to get her on, but she was very nice about it. But apparently, and I watched the tape, she went on with Johnny, and Carson wouldn't have kids on for something like a year after she was on. I mean, she calls it disastrous. I watched the videotape, and you could tell Johnny's patience it was waning. It was really, really hard. So he was really tricky with kids. They either scored with Carson. I mean, that one kid who was a spelling bee champion. It's like the famous clip he goes on with Johnny, and Johnny's doing coin tricks for him, and he's like, "How do you really make the money disappear? You get married." It's a famous Carson clip. He was either really good with kids or they just didn't go well.
Interesting.
Yeah, but Michael Oliver,
Joey Lawrence, I remember him doing very well with.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a classic.
He was up, Joey Lawrence said that he only got to see the show once when he was nauseous up late at night, and Johnny did the looking into the camera, the direct thing, and that always made the anniversary shows. But Michael Oliver did okay, I'd say.
Yeah.
But you never got to do the show.
No, never did the Carson show.
You did a ton with Leno.
You
You did a ton of the Tonight shows with Leno, but never did a Carson.
It definitely, if sometimes if Jim McCauley and Johnny perceived a comedian as being to David Letterman, they did Letterman a lot. They wouldn't necessarily get to do the show with Johnny.
So you were more considered more 12:30 than 11:30.
I think so.
You did a handful of Lettermans.
Loads of Lettermans. He
Yeah.
used to call me in for those sketches in the beginning of the show. Those were fun. Now, what I found really odd growing up when Carson was on the air is, there's been a million, urban legends and showbiz urban legends. But with Carson, what was so sick about it, there'd be these urban legends about Carson, which everyone would swear to you they saw.
The Jane Fonda thing, it never happened.
Yes,
We're talking about Zsa Zsa. It never happened.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's just a myth. It's just a myth.
Yeah.
Just a TV myth.
I mean, the thing that's a myth to me that I only know one person that has a tape and I've never seen it is I sat down with Rich Little in Vegas and he says he has the tape of Dick Shawn destroying the Tonight Show set, but I've not talked to anybody that's ever actually seen it. I've talked to people in the Carson camp. People say that they think it happened. Some people... but no one has the videotape other than Rich Little, and
That's
I have to watch it.
bizarre. Didn't you have Dick Shawn's son?
Zsa Zsa Gabor,
Yeah, Adam Shawn, yeah.
she had a cat in her lap, according to legend.
As the story goes, yeah.
And Carson, she said to Carson, "Would you like to pet my pussy?" And he said, "Yeah, if you'd get the damn cat out of the way."
I have seen clips of Jane Fonda telling that story.
That was near the Johnny retired May 22nd, 92, and that was, I think, in the last month or so. It was definitely near the end that she told that. But there are people that are convinced it happened.
I'm glad you said the date, by the way, because that's what we're doing here.
That's why
It's
I'm here.
25 years ago
Yes.
this week that Johnny...
Can you believe it?
Yeah, left May 22nd. Johnny left the air. So
And there was another story that there was some actress on who was a lesbian. And she said, I'd like to show you, the love of my life. And then she points to this woman in the crowd. And according to legend, Carson goes, oh, what a waste.
wow,
I
Yeah.
have never heard of that.
I don't know
I'm not
that one either.
You know, the first 10 years were erased, most of them.
I was gonna ask you about that.
There are some that were saved. I was with Ed Ames. I couldn't believe Scott Rogowski, our friend Scott Rogowski.
Yes, our mutual pal Scott.
I was heading to LA and he said, do you know who's still around? Ed Ames. And I said, you have to be kidding me.
Yep.
So I reached out and Ed Ames personally called me, and sure enough, I sat down with him. And
It's one of your best episodes.
Oh, it was really amazing to hear
yeah.
him talk about the tomahawk. But that was one of those things where Carson, in his brilliance, realized we have to preserve this clip. And I think Johnny put it in his drawer. And it's funny because Ed Ames mentioned that he would go on sometimes with Johnny 5 nights in a row and sing the same song. They had an hour and 45 minutes. When they first started, and then it went down to 90 minutes. They had all this time to kill.
Sure.
And can you imagine a late night show now having the same music singer on every night singing the same song 5 nights?
I remember the 90-minute version, and you would get usually an author at
Yes.
the tail end of the show.
I mean, Buck Henry. Told me when
Buck
they went
Henry.
down to 90, when they went down to 60 minutes, you lost a lot of the intellectuals.
Oh, yeah.
It became a completely different show.
The old days, you'd get Calvin Trillin, or you'd get Norman Mailer, or you'd get
Gore Vidal.
You'd get Gore Vidal, and you'd get those Irma Bombeck.
Johnny wanted to pick up the pace of the show, and that certainly did happen. But I definitely think I have heard from many people that he regretted it.
So a little origin first. You and I have known each other forever.
Yeah.
You've known Gilbert a long time.
Yeah.
You were at our comedy writers party.
That's right.
A couple years ago. How did you and why did you decide to devote what I'm guessing is a large part of your life? Because I know how much effort this show is.
Oh, gosh.
Into doing a podcast about Johnny.
He was one of those figures that was larger than life. When he retired, I think that there was a mystery, almost like J.D. Salinger, when he bid America farewell, and he showed up twice on Letterman doing cameos,
Yeah.
and he did The Simpsons. But I think he did Bob Hope 90th birthday, but that was it. It was this fascination. I had so many questions about Carson, about his Tonight Show. His stable of his inner circle never talked publicly. All the books about him, there were very few. Almost all of them were very negative with people that had, in my opinion, I could be wrong. They seemed like that they had a bad experience, but the people that were actually friends with him, his coworkers, they'd never talked publicly. And I had so many questions. And guess, people were very protective of Johnny. And I will say that Peter Jones' documentary on Carson, the American Masters, was, I think, the thing that started to soften people a little bit.
Well, that's where you get the first glimpse into his troubled relationship with his mother.
That
in that
been
documentary.
A theme. People have told me that, people that
and
knew
his,
him.
and his ongoing troubled relationship, I guess you could fair to say, with women.
I sat down with Matt Weiner, who created Mad Men, and we talked about the similarities with Carson and with Don Draper. And there were definitely, Johnny was a complicated guy, a very shy person. But talking to David Steinberg and people that knew him, if he felt comfortable with you, if it was Steve Lawrence, Newhart, Rickles, Peter LaSalle, and Johnny, he was pretty much the same Johnny that you would see on The Tonight Show. It's just around, if he did not know the person, he would not make eye contact a lot of times. He would put his head down, and he was just painfully shy.
Interesting.
And the Jerry Lewis character in King of Comedy was based on Carson.
Jerry Langford. As the story goes, Johnny was approached
He was,
to
and
play that part.
he tried to get De Niro, I believe, to be a guest. I think he was trying to barter because De Niro back then, Hoffman, Streep, Pacino, they all do the late night shows. None of them went on Carson. I think maybe Hoffman early in his career before he was Hoffman, really Hoffman. But people didn't do those shows. And De Niro, and I think probably rightfully so, said I would not be good on your show. But they did try to get Johnny. But Freddie DeCordova was wonderful.
Oh, well, Freddie turns up he's in the King of Comedy.
Yeah.
Let's ask you about Freddie, since it kind of comes up
Yeah.
in the research I did in listening to your episodes, and that Freddie apparently did not do a lot of work. That LaSalle gets the lion's share of the credit, and I don't want to malign a dead man,
It's
but that he
amazing.
kind of sleptwalked through the job. 22
years of being charming and drinking vodka, apparently, during the show. And that he was just exuded charm. So many people I talked to that worked on the show said he was funny, charming, handsome man, and that Peter Lasalle was happy to do the work, and Freddie just would stay in his office, 80 degrees, smoky. I talked to one guest recently that said that they would joke he was the devil because his office was always hot and smoky. And
did you ever meet him, Gil? Freddie, as Rickles used to call him, Decudova. He used to mangle his name.
As a matter of fact, because he worked also when Leno was doing it.
Yes, he was a consultant. He was there for, I think, the first couple years of Jay.
And he said, and I had been doing these like guest spots for those sketches Leno would call me in for. And one time DeCordofer asked one of the writers, he said, who is that kid? And he goes, that's Gilbert Gottfried. He's a comedian. He's been in these movies, these TV shows. He's all over the place. And he goes, oh, I thought he was some kid like a busboy or something.
How flattering.
Yeah.
DeCordova was larger than life, and everybody says that if he perceived a weakness and saw a vulnerability, that he would just go for the jugular.
Really?
And Johnny just couldn't believe it, and a lot of people that knew him couldn't believe it. He went broke. I mean, when he passed away, Johnny sent Fred's widow, Janet, a check for $100,000, and he just, I guess she was a spendthrift. That's what I've been told.
Why did they fall out?
Why did Freddie go broke?
No, why did he fall out with Johnny?
Oh, that's it. Okay. So Rick Carson, I believe, was 39 years old. Johnny's son passed away. He was a photographer, and it was a horrible accident. I don't think Johnny did the show for something like 6 weeks. It was definitely took like a month off, and it was. I've talked to people that said that when he came in for the first day, he had been gone a month. Johnny that people were worried about him. He got through the show the first night, and at the very end, they did a tribute to his son, and he said a minute or two just talking about his son and just this outpouring of love from the public, and then they showed a clip montage of his son's photography. But when he was setting everything up, and I've heard other people that have studied this film. I think Bill Zamey, who is a Carson expert, said he studied this film like the Zimbruder film. You can see,
wow.
And I've watched it. I have watched it many times. You can see it for a split second. Carson looking over off camera, and it's DeCordova. Apparently, he's on the phone or giving that wrap it up sign or something like that because the show was done in real time. I mean, we can talk about that later. That if they did not stop tape unless. Right. Della Reese had a stroke when she was guest hosting the show.
Did you know
tape.
that, Gil?
No.
Yeah, they had to stop tape.
We can talk about those
and
moments.
There was a John Davidson thing where they stopped
Yes, we
tape?
can talk about all of that. But so there's people over there that told me it was one of the rare times that they actually saw Johnny really irate. I mean, he was, after the show, he told Fred DeCordova, you will never step foot on
was
the
he
set of the
speeding him
show
up
again.
Through his was he
yeah,
through his
he was
through his
he
son's,
was exactly to
his
stay
son's tribute
to stay on within the 60 minutes. It was the yeah. So Johnny, I mean, it was just so hard for Johnny to do this, and DeCordova kept up the appearances that he was still running things. He would go into the guest dressing room, but Peter Lasalle, the last 2 years or so, was running the show, and Fred would be off to the side, not even in the studio, but just in offices, and apparently would make snide comments about Johnny. It's like, how Johnny, Fred, what's it like to work with a genius? And he's like, well, I did work with one genius, and his name was Fred Allen.
Wow.
Like that, so.
Wow. But it seems like it was a strange place to work from everything you hear. And, you had Mike Reese on the show. We had him here. But the writers didn't even interact with him. They didn't meet him.
It's interesting that you say that.
Except for maybe a select few.
Back in the 60s, there was a period where Marshall Brickman was head writer, and they would go every month or so to the UN, to Johnny's apartment, and the writers would sit down with him. And the last couple years, you had Daryl Vickers and Andrew Nichols, they were head writers, and they went to Johnny and they said, I would think it would be good for you to sit down with the writers. And Johnny started having the writers, I think it was weekly to Malibu to sit down with him, and that changed. And
okay.
And he definitely, I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but in retirement, he would have lunch with his writers, and his writers would actually give him material, and he would perform it at the lunches for them.
Geez. I didn't know that. I know he was sending material to Dave at the end.
Exactly. Peter Lasalle said
Letterman.
you need to send this in. But the thing is when I was when he left, Carson left the show when I was a teenager, and you'd read things every so often about Johnny, very rare. The media liked to play it off that he was this recluse guy, but he was taking magic lessons. He was going to Africa with Bob Wright on safaris with Jim Fowler. He was learning Swahili. He was still doing the poker game. He was out and about. I mean, he definitely would retreat on the Serengeti, his yacht, and he definitely he was a loner. I mean, there's no question about that. And a lot of people that would spend time with him, like Carl Reiner, would say you never really got personal with him. But he definitely was not a Howard Hughes type person that was just hiding in the corner by himself. He was out and about.
And what are these stories where they had to stop filming?
That is a good question. So there are very few. They stopped taping. Della Reese, when she guest hosted, had a stroke. They stopped. John Davidson, apparently the story goes, John told me, that I don't know if there was a strike or not, but there was something wrong with the sound where Johnny couldn't hear the laughs from the monologue, so he thought he bombed, and then John Davidson got up and the monitor was messed up, so he kicked, I think, a speaker, and the electricity all went down, and they had to put a rerun on that night. They had to stop tape, rerun that night.
Wow.
And that was, those were two. I know that at one point they had to stop tape where a gentleman from the audience actually got up onto this, made it to the stage. I think Carson was interviewing Buddy Hackett, and an audience member just sat down, and Carson tried, he's like, yes, and in it, try to go with it for a little bit, and Buddy Hackett said, you know what, this is never going to air, and they stopped tape, and Carson was upset.
Did you know that, Gil? That's good stuff. Somebody from the audience went out and sat next to Hackett.
And there's another one, there's a comedian who, Tom Shales, I talked to him, and I forget who it is, if Shales even told me, but there was a comedian that went out that just went completely blank. Nowadays, on certain shows, they will have kind of a cheat sheet, a cue card for the comedians, but Johnny and Dave didn't do that. And there's a guy that just came out that just, he came out, like 5 seconds of panic, and I guess ran behind the curtain, and Johnny stopped tape, and Johnny was a comedian's comedian. He really cared, and he said, let's stop tape. This can happen to anyone. We're going to do this again. And
so he was compassionate about it.
But then again, you have someone like John Davidson, again, who another time forgot his song lyrics. Now, my dad went to 6B, the sixth floor of NBC in the 60s. Barbara McNair and Doug McClure were on. Doug McClure had his music on cue cards. John Davidson said you had the option if you wanted cue cards or not if you were a singer. I was at the first Letterman ever on August 30th, 93. Billy Joel absolutely had cue cards to No Man's Land. It was I very rarely would I ever see, though, and I worked in late night a little bit, see somebody that had cue cards. John Davidson, this time, I think it was in the 80s, said, no, I don't need cue cards for this song. And he lost the words very, very quickly and turned to Johnny, can we stop tape? And Johnny said, absolutely not. And John, fun. And it was an amazing segment. I mean, now nobody does the show in real time. I mean, they're the first ones to stop it. It's such an amazing segment. And, he eventually gets it. And the audience is just, he's endeared himself to the audience in those vulnerable moments. That stuff just very rarely. I think there was a moment recently on Seth Meyers that he had a problem with the cue card with Wally, who I know, Ferriston, and it was this really cool exchange. But it just seems that those moments very rarely happen.
Let's talk about Ed Ames to a little more in detail, because it was interesting. And thank you, Scott Rogowski, for making that happen. And he's still with us. Even
Ed Ames is still singing.
Yeah,
he looks incredible.
He's still out there. But the famous tomahawk.
Oh yeah, he throws it and it hits the target in the crotch.
Right.
Listen.
Right. And I found out from listening to your episode that he didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't an experienced. They sell him like because he's playing. What character was he playing?
It was in Daniel Boone, right?
Daniel Boone. Yeah. And they sell him like, oh, he's an experienced. He had no idea.
He had no idea, and it was one of those things where
he's teaching the rotation of the axe, but.
And you can see, I mean, Johnny's brilliance. I mean, he hits the crotch, the audience explodes, and Ed Ames goes for he's going to go pick the axe out, and Johnny stops him. And it has been called, and I don't know if this is an actual record, but it has been called the longest sustained laugh from a studio audience. And if you go to YouTube and you watch the clip, it very may well be.
He's got great instincts, because Ames is about to go retrieve the axe. Johnny pulls on him, stops him, and he kills time by pretending he's sharpening the two axes. Waits for the audience to die down, because he's got the line, because he's got the saver.
And what is that? It's like, don't tell something about being Jewish.
He says, "I didn't know you were
Jewish." Yeah.
And then he also, I think before
It's
that,
great television.
he says to him, he goes, I don't think you can hurt him any worse.
But again, the first 10 years, I mean, almost everything was wiped.
Was Groucho on the first episode?
Yeah, the first episode was actually, the first 15 minutes was all Groucho.
Can you imagine, Gil?
Wow.
Wiped out,
6B.
erased.
Oh,
It's
God.
Groucho with the first 15 minutes. He introduces Carson, and you had 6 months of America waiting to see Johnny while he was contractually obligated to ABC. They would not allow him out of his contract, so you had the 6 months.
Doing the game show.
6 months of guest host where you had Mort Saul, you had Jerry Lewis, you had Jimmy Dean, you had Merv Griffin, you had, I'm trying to think who else, but you had this parade of Jack Carter, of the guest hosts, leading up, and Skitch Henderson and Hugh Downs.
That's
and
right.
then leading up to October 1st, 62, where you had Groucho Marx, and it was this, people, I don't know if people know what a big media event this thing was. I mean, it was so built up, and Johnny has Groucho bring him on after 15 minutes, and then it's Mel Brooks, 36-year-old Mel Brooks, 36-year-old Tony Bennett, Rudy Valley, and Joan Crawford.
How about that?
Wow.
Gone to the
First
dustbin of history.
all, the idea that Mel Brooks and Tony Bennett were ever 35.
Yeah, 36. But yeah. Sure.
And Brooks did this thing. He reverted to Borscht Belt, and he got up on his desk, and he told me that Tony Bennett was ticked because he was making fun of Tony Bennett. He was mocking Tony Bennett singing High. And somebody told me, and I don't know if this is true, that's when Tony Bennett was debuting I Left My Heart in San Francisco.
Wow.
I can't believe it.
25 years, May 22nd, 1992.
I was in Hershey, Pennsylvania on that Friday night watching it. I remember it very vividly.
Were you watching it, Gil? When Johnny went off the air? Yeah, it was
with
sad.
Bette Midler.
No, that was the penultimate. That was the next to last.
And that is an interesting point that you bring that up because Johnny and Peter LaSalle wanted that episode to be the last one. For people listening, I don't know if you know this or not, but they do a postmortem after most late night shows where you'll have the host, the producers, and the director, and they kind of talk about the show. If there's anything that needs to be edited and post, which
they
are
do it in
censored.
daytime too.
Yes, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So they did after the Bette Midler, Robin Williams, which was just incredible television. I mean, just spontaneously, Bette Midler and Johnny singing "Here's That Rainy Day" together a cappella with, I think Ed Shaughnessy told Bette in the dressing room that was Johnny's favorite song, and it was just this amazing. Mark
sweet.
Shaman doing "One for My Baby," and then Bette Midler apparently backstage just afterwards puts the lei over Johnny's head and runs off sobbing backstage. And at the postmortem, Peter and Johnny said that this should be our last episode. We don't want to do another episode.
They couldn't top it.
They couldn't. I mean, the last episode had no guests. Of course, NBC probably wanted to make this prime time gigantic thing.
Of course.
And Johnny, the classy man he wanted, just wanted to go out very quietly. And it was the guest montage where they had, I think, 55 people set to Memories of You with Doc and the orchestra underneath. And then it was the first time ever that they showed behind the scenes. And I asked Jeff Sotzig of Carson Entertainment, how did Johnny take that with cameras following him around? That had never happened. I said, was that hard for Johnny? He said, oh, absolutely. It took him a long time to kind of get used to that. Dave Letterman did the similar thing on the last episode where they finally showed after 30 years kind of how they put the show together. But I like the final episode. It was classy.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah, you wanted, what the audience really wanted was Johnny.
Oh, absolutely.
They didn't even need guests.
And
they just wanted that one-on-one relationship. They wanted to say goodbye.
It's true. And then it was very strange for the staff because it was the first time that the staff had been in the audience, most of them. And you had David Steinberg was in the audience, Bill Zamy was in the audience, and you had all these, Johnny's 2 sons and his wife Alex, but to have his writers and the Tonight Show staff in front of him in those 400 plus seats in Burbank, and for him to say goodbye to America, and then he went straight to the Elephant Doors where a limousine waited to pick him up, him and his wife Alex up, and then the limousine went not too far to the helicopter pad, and then the helicopter whisked them away to Malibu where they had a wrap party with and Les Brown Orchestra, and it was the first time, obviously, that most people had ever been to Johnny's estate in Malibu, and that's how everything
Can
ended.
you imagine psychologically what was going through his
my
head when he
God.
just wrapped it for the last time? After,
Yeah.
I mean, the
What
sense.
was it, 25 years?
No,
It was 30. It was
30.
29 and 6 or 7 months. And
Yeah.
apparently, I mean, Rick Ludwin, who was vice president of late night, told me he went to. He thought that somebody from NBC should say thank you, and went down to Johnny's basement office. And Johnny apparently that day was just jotting down what he was going to say on a legal pad. Fritz Coleman told me that he wanted on the last day just to say thank you for everything that you mean to me. And he was just. I think Carson said it was strange, but it was just another day. And I think that he just wanted to go out on top.
Of course.
I mean,
Of course.
The thing that really bothered him was he did not want to become Bob Hope, and those Saturday Night Live sketches.
You were telling us before we turned the mics on. The Carcinio sketches bothered
That one
him?
didn't bother him. Robert Smigel penned these sketches, and NBC didn't really want SNL to do it, but Lorne Michaels, to his credit, gives his writers creative freedom, and I guess Robert Smigel perceived Johnny as being maybe out of touch and would write these sketches. And I actually just watched this episode of Dana Carvey on with Johnny, and it was one of the rare moments where Carvey did his Johnny impersonation for Johnny, and it was just, you could tell Johnny, he was trying to be a good sport about it, but it was hard to watch. And apparently Dana Carvey said that Jay Leno told him right before he announced his retirement, that Johnny was in the halls of Burbank and said, if they're going to make fun of me, I'm out of here. And that was, I think, right before the Carnegie Hall where he announced his retirement. But he just did not want to be perceived as Bob Hope. And those sketches
As
really
hanging on too long.
Yeah, and the sketches bothered him. That one, the Carcinio one, apparently
He always had a contentious relationship with Saturday Night Live.
It was.
Ever since they knocked the Saturday reruns off the air.
the Chevy Chase, Chevy Chase New York Magazine piece, saying that he would be like maybe the rain, and he definitely had a huge problem with SNL. And I think that last year, when he started having problems with the show, the bookings stopped for Dana Carvey. I don't think Victoria Jackson did the show after that. And his final week, he took a shot at Saturday Night Live in the monologue. They did a cold open. I think Woody Harrelson, Vanessa Williams' season finale of 90 would have been 92. And they did a cold open that Smigel wrote. And it was, Phil Hartman being drunk for the finale. And Johnny it really got to him, and he took a pot shot. I said the monologue this was the final week or two of the show. He said, in NBC programming next year they're actually going to make a comedy version of Saturday Night Live.
Wow,
that was his joke. He said, and then he said something about striking back or something.
Are you old enough to remember that before SNL debuted in '75 that slot was a Carson rerun on Saturday night?
I know that's why Ebersol and Lorne Michaels. That's why Johnny wanted something to replace it. But that's amazing to think about.
Yeah.
Johnny just thought it was too much of the Tonight Show, and that's what. Yeah.
It was one of the few nights I got to watch Johnny Carson because I didn't have to get up and go to school.
Yes.
It's like Carson, he made a few there was the famous ad lib about Chevy Chase saying he couldn't ad-lib a fart.
That was the cast. Johnny watched Good Nights, and they had like a minute or two to kill. But he said that about the cast, but he definitely was ticked about that Chevy Chase New York Magazine story, which is not Chevy's fault. And they became friendly with the card game years later.
Yeah.
But I mean, oh my gosh, there's this episode. It's really hard to watch with Gallagher and Chevy Chase and Chevy on
You
Carson.
sure it's not Gallagher too?
And Chevy takes a shot at Gallagher. Gallagher tells a joke on panel, and it doesn't go well. And Chevy gets a dig in, and then the rest of the episode is throughout the episode is Gallagher taking shots at Chevy, and the audience really loving this. And Johnny, it just cuts to Johnny, and he's loving this. I definitely think with some of the SNLers, he would have them on occasionally, but he was just loving Chevy getting beaten up verbally by Gallagher.
Tell us about putting the show together. Tell us about booking the show. And because for people that aren't familiar with the podcast, and again, we'll plug it because it's great, the Carson podcast, you have a lot of behind-the-scenes people, too. You've mentioned Rick Ludwin. You've mentioned some of the other people we talked about Bob Shane, but you've had other people on the show.
Peter LaSalle,
who
the New York Times calls, I think, the host whisperer, was Arthur Godfrey's producer.
Right, and became Dave's go-to guy.
Yeah, he was Dave's EP. He was Tom Snyder's EP. He was Johnny's EP. Peter was somebody I really wanted on. I got a message to him within, I think, like a half hour. I got a call from CBS Television City, and his charming assistant Chris had Peter's hold for Peter, and Peter. I basically said, I know you don't do interviews almost ever, and I know you hate them, but you do not know how much this would mean to me. And the reason he said that he would do it is because of my email, and he's like, it was genuine. I said, I know it was, and I went to Television City, CBS, where they did Jack Benny, and I mean, they do right now. They do Price is Right and Bill Maher.
Bill Maher's still there, yeah.
But I mean, they
Fairfax.
all in the family. I mean, it's so historic.
sure.
And I went to Peter's office, and it was amazing talking to him. I mean, I don't know if you guys know his background. Holocaust survivor. He knew Anne Frank.
I don't know.
Yeah,
That's really fascinating.
He's a remarkable man. He was an NBC page, and then he worked for Godfrey, and
Your favorite, Gil?
Oh, yes. The
Arthur
Godfrey was a major anti-Semite.
That is what who I just read that you know who,
Comes up on
Shelley
this show a lot.
Schultz. Shelley Schultz is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think, as a manager, and he worked on the Tonight Show. He was the one that booked Cosby and Joan Rivers, and he apparently I just saw an interview with him, and he said the same thing that you just said, and I have no idea if that's true or not.
Yeah.
I know that Peter had a good experience, but at the same time, Peter told me the same thing about Johnny, is that Peter was given the advice, if Arthur invites you to go to his farmhouse on the weekend or wherever his retreat is, say no. Just say no, and he always would, because if they get to spend time with you, they might get to not like you. And apparently Bob Shanks said the same thing to Cavett about Jack Parr. Don't go away with them.
So keep that professional distance from
yes,
from these
apparently
guys.
so.
I tried to do that with Gilbert.
Yeah. But, getting to
It hasn't
Godfrey.
worked.
Peter LaSalle was telling me, and I've done research, Godfrey was over with the American public more than Oprah. I mean, I don't think people can imagine that, that captures
he was
that.
beloved.
I mean, is there anybody on television now, any figure that has that pull?
And there was
can't
one
think of any.
thing, and I remember I took sides with the other guy on this because I thought he was a performer.
I know who you're going to say.
Okay.
Julia LaRosa. What's
Julius
his name?
LaRosa.
No,
That's not what you were going to say? I thought that's what you were going to say.
This was an incident when Uri Geller.
Oh, that's what we're saying. Oh, I thought we were still talking about
on the Tonight Show.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he was like, read minds,
Ben
and
Spoons. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all, and he was sabotaged by Johnny Carson.
I think, in my opinion, I haven't talked to Uri Geller. I'd like to. I talked to James Randi, the amazing Randy, who went on with Johnny a lot, was friends with Randy. The Johnny Carson Foundation, I think, still contributes financially to support Randy, who is a skeptic. He basically told Johnny, he took him through the entire appearance. He said, do not let them use their own spoons. Don't let them use their own equipment. Have somebody watching all the equipment the entire time. Do not let them use any of their own equipment. And Uri Geller on television just couldn't perform. And I know Uri Geller says, in his defense, he says that you had this person that didn't believe. There's a lot of negativity in the room, and I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said that you can't always pull that off. But it was a very uncomfortable. I think they did 2 segments.
Why would Johnny sabotage another magician? He was a magician himself.
Yeah.
I don't think he thought he was a magician. Uri Geller really claimed that he could bend spoons.
I see.
He could do all these things.
So Johnny was trying to
I think
debunk.
Johnny didn't believe it. I mean, Johnny was upset. Johnny in retirement would watch Larry King and loved Sylvia Brown, the psychic, because he's like, I can't believe people believe this. He would like Robert Tilton. Carson really like was shared Randy's belief on that stuff on the psychics. So. Yeah, the Uri Geller thing was I know that was a disastrous appearance, but I mean, I think it couldn't have helped that I think Carson was very polite, but you could tell the tone that he there was not maybe a lack of warmth, I think.
You read stories about him turning on people sometimes.
Oh,
so
my
we're
gosh.
talking not only the decor of a story, which may be justified because he was in grief, and who knows if that was that was long in coming. But Pete Barbuti getting blacklisted from the show.
Dick Shawn got blacklisted as
Dick
well,
Shawn
but then
too.
they had him back. They brought Dick Shawn back a year or two before he passed.
And I heard also Charlie Callis.
Charlie Callis got more negative mail than any. I just sat down. I sat down
bizarre.
recently with back on the 6th floor of NBC here in New York, on the 6th floor of what was the RCA building. They would have these women. They were only young women called correspondents, and the correspondents would answer the phones and they would answer Johnny's mail, and they would have to take the mail home because there was so much mail. And apparently what would happen is they would have to keep a log of the complaints that would come in. And Charlie Callis and Woody Allen apparently were the two people, when Woody would guest host and Charlie Callis would come on, that the phones would ring off the hook with complaints.
I don't understand that at all.
I don't know.
It's strange.
And I mean, Woody Allen, of course, great. And Charlie Callis always made me laugh.
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, the person I talked to told me, the people that watched the show were Middle America, and anything that was not Middle America, maybe Woody Allen, just that some the section of people that just didn't want that. I guess.
Little too Semitic for the Tonight Show
was
audience.
just gonna ask
Is that what's being suggested?
Woody guest hosting the Tonight Show was wonderful. We were talking beforehand about some of the people that guest hosted the show that I don't think most people know, like Peter Bogdanovich.
Yeah, you were
guest
telling
hosted
us
twice.
that Bogdanovich came out and did a monologue.
He did.
Which is rather stunning.
And
Yeah.
what is the true story to the Joan Rivers?
It's very complicated. I want to preface this. If Joan Rivers was here, I think her narrative is. I think she would deny everything that the Carson people say. And the thing that's very hard is Joan Rivers, for over a decade, would go on television, and it seemed like so many interviews would just give her version of of what happened, and she would say it over and over again until it got in the public consciousness. And the version of the Carson camp, Johnny was. He never. I don't want to say he was too classy, because Joan was very classy. I'd met her. I worked with her a little bit. She was wonderful. Johnny just, his quote was, I was never upset. I just would have handled it differently. That's all. But we both all know he was upset. So here's the deal. They went to dinner. It was I think 3 weeks beforehand. And they were still negotiating with Joan to guest host the show. And she had signed her contract with Fox. They had no idea that she had signed the contract. And Rivers called Carson. Brandon Tartikoff had gotten to Carson right beforehand and said, and I guess Joan Rivers called DeCordova, and DeCordova said, "You're kidding me." I've been told by somebody with good knowledge that Johnny broke down and cried when he found out that Joan was going to Fox. And that itself would have been fine. Everybody said if Joan would have sat down with him, said, I had this opportunity,
that's my understanding
that he would have
of
been
it.
the first one. But the way that he perceived it to be, that she did this behind his back, just I've been told that he cried, that he was really. He already had issues sometimes. I think with his mom, and sometimes wives.
It's fair to say, and if you watch that American Masters doc, he had some issues with women. I'm not saying necessarily it played out here with Joan. But he had some issues.
He had very healthy relationships, though, with people, with women.
Oh, I'm not
as well,
suggesting it. I'm not suggesting it.
But he definitely, I think the trust thing with him, and he felt betrayed. And the thing that was very difficult, and again, I think if Joan Rivers was here, she would deny it. And I have no idea what happened. I really am Switzerland. I have no idea. I've talked to several people on staff that told me that Joan Rivers tried to take them to go. And Peter LaSalle went on record. And one other person went on record with me, and one other person off when I wasn't recording, that Joan tried to take Johnny's staff. I mean, it's one thing to compete, but to try to take the guy who made you staff, that was one thing that was definitely a thing that bothered him, and just the negotiations that they were still negotiating. Yeah. I mean, Joan Rivers said that there was a list that of 10 people, and she wasn't on the list. I've talked to everybody. There was no list, according to anyone, that ever existed. And if there was, how would she find out about it, of 10 successors? I mean, nobody at NBC will validate this list. Nobody at The Tonight Show of 10 successors. There would never be a list of 10 successors, in my opinion. Maybe 5, maybe 3. But I don't know. I mean, apparently Joan saw Johnny at least once in public, and she sent him condolence when his son died. I think she reached out to him when Edgar took his life, which was tragic, her husband. And I know she saw him in public at least once, I think at a restaurant, and tried to go up to him, and Johnny just
Nothing.
He wouldn't. Once, and I've talked to Johnny's first producer, Perry Cross, said once he turned on you, that was it.
And tell us, this is a little off that subject, but it's also about an altercation. Tell us about Paul Williams, our friend Paul Williams and George Papard.
You know,
There's an issue. Do you know about this, Gil?
This is good already.
This is something I learned from listening to the Mark Malkoff Carson podcast.
I don't think it's any secret. Paul Williams has been on both of our shows. That
we love him.
He had some issues in the 70s.
Yeah, of course. We just talked about it.
Yeah,
Like,
of course.
Insane stories.
And George Papard, I don't think it's a secret as well, had an alcohol issue, and he, I believe, was in. It seemed to me on the videotape that he was intoxicated, and Paul Williams backed that up, and they just started. Papard took some insults on Paul Williams and then called him a midget, and it just got really tense. And Paul Williams said, "Do not call me a midget." And it was one of those things. Now I think they would probably edit this stuff out, but I mean everything got in, all the so-called mistakes, and it was. I think Paul Williams said when he got sober, he had a lot of empathy for George Papard, but that stuff would happen. I mean, they had back in the green room. They had alcohol back for the green room. I mean, I think a lot of shows like Leno, they had the alcohol for the guests.
All of the game shows,
a lot of booze.
They
at
used
the game
to be
shows,
blasted.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
They would. I heard they would wheel around carts of every alcoholic beverage you want. So these guests would be bombed out of their skulls.
Letterman at CBS, the guest would have to ask for it. They had it under lock and key, but if somebody asked for it, they could have it. But I think it depended on the show. But in the green room, there was alcohol. And do you know? So when you see the camera pan the audience, there's a kind of like a little doorway. That's called the well, and that is leads to the green room. And the well is where a lot of comedians would watch. Like, let's say Jimmy Brogan went over for Seinfeld's first debut. A lot of the comedians would congregate in the well, and right behind that would be where the green room would be. And speaking of Brogan, I was telling you a little bit of this about the show. In the last year, I was over at former NBC Burbank, which I think is called Burbank Studios.
Yeah, tell us about it.
I was with
Your
Jimmy
visit.
Brogan. Whenever I'm in Los Angeles, I try to stop by and just kind of do the pilgrimage and go into Studio One. And, you know, the seats are all still in there. All, I think, 450 seats because of, I've heard because of asbestos, they can't pull them out. And it's still, if you look out into the audience, it still has that same exact feel of Carson. And if you go out in the middle of the hallway between Studio 1 and 3, the Rickles thing, when Johnny went across the hall, everything looks the same.
CPO Sharkey.
The hallways look the same. And Brogan and I went to, and this I've done this before previously, we went down to Johnny's dressing room office, which is in the basement.
Jimmy Brogan, we should tell people who he is.
Oh, yeah.
Brogan
was Leno's monologue
Leno's
writer for 9 years. And
Nice man.
He went on the show with Johnny a bunch of times, and he opens up for Jay normally on Sundays in Hermosa Beach. And so Johnny's office was locked, and I said, "Oh, this is a shame." Brogan said, "Mark, follow me." And he leads me through this really narrow entrance where there were like pipes, and I was like, "Where are we going?" And apparently what happened, he got me into Johnny's dressing room, is that they had built for Carson an escape door.
What, like he's Dick Cheney? You had to have a bunker?
Because crazy fans would get into NBC Burbank. And more than once, a deranged fan got into the show. And if there was ever anybody that got into his dressing room, he would have an escape door to get out. Yeah,
Nuts.
But we got it.
Also, I mean, Jerry Lewis used to
He guest hosted a lot, yeah.
And now when Jerry Lewis got his own talk show, it bombed. And yet when Jerry Lewis would be the guest host on Carson, they said those would do great.
I'll tell you why. And this is the insight I've gotten. First of all, when he would do the Tonight Show, it was 90 minutes. His talk show, variety show, was, I think, 2 hours.
2 hours.
A little longer.
Yeah.
And I heard Lewis had too much going on at the time. I mean, because Lewis could do a week, and then he would take sometimes a month or two off before he would guest host. But it was just, I heard he had too much going on with his film career and just couldn't get the proper attention to the show. But I mean, did you hear that story about like they would have to put like JL tiles?
Yes,
in his,
we talked about it with Tom Sharpling.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
It's wild. Tell us, you were telling us too before we turned the mics on that you found some of the people that you've interviewed to be very protective of Johnny's legacy, like Joan Embry.
It's
the great Joan Embry.
Really true. I tried to get her and I couldn't. I wasn't able to get her until I think somebody emailed me. She was promoting Johnny Carson
the
DVDs.
San Diego Zoo.
Yes.
Joan Embry.
I went
Remember, Gil?
I went to New Canaan, Connecticut to sit down with Jim Fowler. He was going on
too.
he was doing the animals stuff back in the 60s. Unknown Barbara Streisand asked him afterwards, "Can you come to my apartment and look at my parakeet?" Streisand in the 60s, early from 62 to like 66 did the show a lot.
You thought that was your line.
I know. But she's very protective. There are a bunch of people that have never talked publicly about Carson until they sat down with me. And I think a lot of it's been a while since Carson passed. I think the documentary
they're protective of
They are. I mean, all those books were always all negative. I mean,
the one guy who I mean, this sounded like a really kind of sleazy, and that was the best known as the bombastic
Bushkin. Oh, Henry.
Yeah. Who was his lawyer and confidant.
That's true. That was his lawyer.
And then after Carson dies, he does like a tell-all book.
Listen, it went to #1 on Amazon. I mean,
I noticed you didn't have him on, and there's a guy that knew Johnny.
Somebody gave me his book. I read it. Somebody that with knowledge said that they're pretty sure almost all of it, if not all of it's true. I just can't separate the fact that he was a lawyer talking about his client. That's just me personally.
Yeah.
So I haven't sat down with him. Perhaps that will change. Listen, I want to get Wayne Newton on. I've tried to get Melissa Rivers. Paul Rodriguez. I've reached out. I'm trying to sit down with people that did not have good experiences, and I haven't been able to sit down with them.
I don't think Jamie Farr had a very good experience.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah. Well,
okay, I'd love to sit down with him.
Check into
but
that.
I've tried to
Hope
sit
I'm
down
not telling
with.
tales out of school.
Oh,
listen,
what were some of the bad experiences?
Wayne Newton showed up to NBC Burbank, got past security, got into Johnny's office.
Oh,
and
that's
said,
famous.
If you're gonna,
yes.
Yeah. So. I mean, that was one. I know Paul Rodriguez said apparently he was on panel, and then the next actress came out, and apparently Rodriguez made a joke during it in a commercial. Johnny just turned on him and swore at him, and that he was finished. Obviously Melissa Rivers with her mom. I'm trying to think who else had bad experiences.
There was a Jamie Farr?
I think so. Yeah, it's in Jamie's book. I'll let Mark get his hands on that story himself.
Yeah, I'd love to sit down.
I have my own bombastic Bushkin story too, which I will not tell here, but I'll tell you guys. I'll tell you guys.
Love to hear it.
Something I was approached about. The show is great.
Oh, thanks.
The show is great. I mean, you get inside the inner workings of that show. You interview the staffers. You even interviewed what's the gentleman's name? Irving Davis.
Irving Davis,
the guy that used to pull the curtain.
20 years.
The curtain.
He would
His curtain man.
He would open the curtain for Johnny, and he would open the curtain for guests, and people like Gregory Peck, these really nervous people that didn't normally do TV. So it was challenging.
And there was an incident. They show this a lot. I mean, everyone always talked about Carson and McMahon's drinking. And there was that one show where, McMahon was obviously shit-faced, and Carson was just kept ragging on him and on the air.
Is that when they're about to introduce Joan Embry? I think Carson and
I think so.
It's the one time. Listen, Ed's character was that he was this big drunk, and it was just not true. But that clip that you're talking about was one of the rare times that Ed was definitely visibly intoxicated on the show. But I mean, listen, Johnny was a professional. He demanded perfection. He was, unless you heard from him, things were going well. If you heard from him, normally it was a problem. But I mean, there's no way that Ed and him started out as friends. They would go out almost every single night after the show in the New York days. Early on, they would go to Danny's Hideaway. They'd go to Sardi's East. They were inseparable. And like a lot of relationships, things started to change. I mean, Ed would go down to Johnny's dressing room before the show up until the last show, and they would have dinner once a year, whereas Doc and Johnny would go on vacation together. So, I mean, they survived 29+ plus years, almost 30 years together.
Oh, yeah.
But their dynamic
well, you
definitely
watch those
changed.
Karnak sketches, and I watched a bunch today prepping for you, and their timing.
Oh, my gosh.
They're an underrated comedy team.
Oh, yeah.
Sis Boom Ba, the Kevin McCollin joke. Kevin McCollin.
The sound of a
wrote
sheep
that.
exploding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sis Boom Ba.
Sis Boom Ba.
Ba. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's so...
well, they had wonderful timing. They had wonderful chemistry. Has anyone heard from Doc, by the way?
Doc is 90 years old. He's in Tennessee. I have his cell phone number. I've talked to him thrice on the phone, and he does not know what a podcast is, apparently.
I'm having that problem booking this show
Yes.
with a couple of people
I
won't
I'm
mention.
Not giving up hope, but I have to say, Doc was really funny when he would.
Oh, God.
When he
Oh,
would
yeah.
sit in Ed's chair
So was
when Ed
Newsom.
wasn't there.
So
yeah.
was Tommy Newsom funny.
Newsom was really good too. I mean, I think that they really lucked out in terms of the personalities on that show.
There was nothing like it. It was a special time. Not only a great talk show, but it was that time in show business history. It was the right show for the right time.
It was, and you had these amazing people like Dave Letterman and Shanley guest hosting that show. I mean,
and George Carlin.
George
guest
Carlin
hosting
was
the show,
amazing.
And everybody.
And I want to say Johnny was secure enough with himself as a performer to have guest host. Whereas unless Jimmy Kimmel he had to take some time off recently, or Dave Letterman had his heart issues, it never happens. I mean, Jay Leno only gave up his seat once to who? Katie Couric.
Right.
That was it. Brandon Tartikoff tried to get him to do Fridays to Rosie O'Donnell, and he just wouldn't do it. And that's Jay's prerogative. That's every host. It's their show.
Mark, the show is great. The Carson podcast, I'm going to recommend a couple of episodes I listened to. I love the Fred Silverman one. Now, there's a guy we got to get on this show,
my
Fred
God.
Silverman. So we're going to hit Mark up.
And he was the producer of Thick of the Night.
Oh, my God. You
So-
guys can do an hour. And you
Maybe
had
two.
Pete Barbuti, all the old Carson staples. You had Kreskin. You had Jim Fowler and Joan Embry we talked about, Ed Ames. You got a lot of great behind-the-scenes people. David Say. Remember David Say?
Oh, my God, yes.
Yeah. It's an education, and it's like this show. It's a time capsule. So where can people get it?
CarsonPodcast.com on iTunes, Carson Podcast.
Wherever fine podcasts are sold.
Exactly.
And I will give a shout-out to Alex Brazel,
Oh, yes.
our pal, the guru. Gil?
And this, very simply, was Gilbert and Frank's amazing, colossal obsessions.
And 25 years ago, we said goodbye to Johnny. So we all raise a glass. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And so it has come to this. I am one of the lucky people in the world. I found something I always wanted to do, and I have enjoyed every single minute of it. I want to thank the gentleman who shared this stage with me for 30 years, Mr. Ed McMahon, Mr. Doc Severinsen, and you people watching. I can only tell you that it has been an honor and a privilege to come into your homes all these years and entertain you. And I hope when I find something that I want to do and I think you will like and come back, that you'll be as gracious in inviting me into your home as you have been. I bid you a very heartfelt good night.